At first glance, satellite images of the target showed nothing more than a modest fishing harbor. Wooden piers, small boats tied up along a quiet stretch of coastline in Iran's Bushehr province, the kind of place that wouldn't register as a military target to anyone glancing at it casually. And then American precision munitions hit it anyway on July 9th at a location called Banood Pier. And within minutes, the satellite imagery showed something completely different. Plumes of smoke, boats burning on the water, and footage circulating afterward confirmed exactly what American intelligence had apparently already determined. That quiet fishing harbor wasn't what it appeared to be at all. That single strike at Banood Pier is one small piece of a pattern that's now become one of the most significant and least understood developments of this entire war. Since July 8th, the United States has carried out more than 300 separate strikes against Iran, and a substantial portion of them haven't targeted nuclear facilities, missile sites, or air defense networks in the way most coverage of this war tends to focus on. They've targeted small ports, fishing piers, modest coastal infrastructures stretching from Bushehr all the way to Chabahar, sites that, on the surface, look like exactly what Iran claims they are: civilian fishing operations with no military significance whatsoever. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly why the United States is hitting targets that look this unremarkable, what satellite imagery and open source intelligence have actually revealed hiding inside these coastal locations, why this specific targeting pattern represents a genuinely new phase in how this war is being fought, and why what's actually concealed at these sites should change how you think about everything Iran has been doing in the Strait of Hormuz throughout this entire conflict. Stay with me for the full breakdown, because this is a story that requires connecting satellite imagery, open source footage, and CENTCOM's own confirmed statements to actually understand. Quick note on sourcing before we start. Everything here comes from detailed reporting by The National, a Gulf region outlet that has done extensive open source analysis on this specific pattern of strikes, cross-referenced against CENTCOM's own official statements, satellite imagery analysis, and CNN's live coverage of the strikes as they've unfolded. I'll be clear throughout about what's confirmed through official CENTCOM statements, what's been independently verified through satellite imagery and social media footage, and where analysis remains inference based on the pattern of strikes rather than a direct official confirmation. Let's build this from the actual pattern of targets. To understand why these coastal sites matter so much, you need to understand what CENTCOM has said about the broader purpose behind this specific wave of strikes, because the justification connects directly to a threat we've covered extensively in previous videos. CENTCOM's own public statement was direct. American forces struck Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, specifically to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten what CENTCOM described as innocent mariners crewing commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. That framing puts these coastal strikes squarely inside the broader blockade and shipping security campaign we've covered in detail in earlier videos, the same campaign responsible for the naval blockade, the destroyer engagement we broke down previously, and Iran's own declared closure of the strait. But here's where this specific wave of strikes becomes genuinely different from everything else we've covered about this war so far, and it's the part of the story that deserves the most attention. According to detailed open source analysis, Washington appears to be systematically targeting one of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' most effective and least discussed military assets, its fleet of heavily armed fast attack boats. And the reason these strikes have hit fishing harbors, piers, and coastal infrastructure that look civilian on the surface is because that's exactly where this specific fleet has been hiding. I want to pause here for a second. Because if this kind of investigative, satellite imagery-driven breakdown actually explaining why a target that looks harmless turns out to be strategically significant is the kind of depth you want from war coverage, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. I track every one of these strike patterns and connect them to the broader strategic picture exactly like this, rather than just reporting that a strike happened without explaining why the specific target actually mattered. Let's keep going, because the actual tactic Iran has been using at these sites is genuinely clever, and understanding it changes how you see this entire dimension of the war. Let's talk about exactly what's been hiding at these coastal sites, because the tactic itself represents a deliberate, sophisticated concealment strategy, rather than an accident of Iran's coastline simply having a lot of fishing infrastructure. Many of Iran's fast attack boats, the same small, heavily armed vessels responsible for swarming attacks against commercial shipping, and, as we covered in a previous video, the coordinated assault against 3 American destroyers back in May, can be concealed among ordinary civilian fishing vessels at exactly these kinds of small, unremarkable ports. A fast attack boat tied up alongside dozens of genuine fishing boats at a modest pier doesn't stand out to a casual observer. doesn't require the kind of dedicated naval infrastructure that would immediately flag a location as militarily significant, and provides exactly the kind of low-profile, dispersed basing that makes a fleet considerably harder to locate, track, and eventually target, compared to keeping that same fleet concentrated at a single, obviously military naval facility. Think about the strategic logic behind this approach from Iran's perspective, because it's a genuinely rational response to the kind of technological and intelligence disadvantage Iran has faced throughout this entire war. We've covered in previous videos how satellite imagery, synthetic aperture radar, and persistent American surveillance have repeatedly exposed hidden Iranian facilities throughout this conflict, from Pickaxe Mountain's tunnel construction to the precisely targeted response following the destroyer attack. A concentrated, obviously military naval base is an easy target for exactly that kind of sustained surveillance. Dispersing the same fleet across dozens of small, visually unremarkable fishing harbors along hundreds of kilometers of coastline, from Bushehr all the way to Chabahar, forces American intelligence to solve a fundamentally harder problem. Not just monitoring a handful of known military installations, but distinguishing genuine civilian fishing activity from military assets deliberately blended into it across an enormous stretch of coastline. This dispersal tactic actually has deep roots in Iran's broader military doctrine, extending well beyond just this specific war. The IRGC Navy has operated separately from Iran's conventional navy for decades, specifically built around asymmetric tactics designed to offset America's overwhelming conventional naval superiority in the Gulf. Concealing fast attack assets among civilian infrastructure isn't a wartime improvisation invented specifically for this conflict. It's a long-standing element of that broader doctrine, one that's been discussed in defense and security literature covering Iran's naval strategy going back years before this current war ever began. What's changed in this specific conflict is that the doctrine is now being tested under genuine, sustained combat conditions against an adversary actively working to defeat it, rather than remaining a largely theoretical concern discussed in military planning documents and academic analysis. And that's exactly the intelligence problem American forces appear to have solved, at least partially, based on the pattern of strikes that's followed. This is where open-source intelligence analysis becomes genuinely fascinating, because reconstructing exactly how these sites were identified and confirmed as legitimate military targets, rather than genuine civilian fishing infrastructure, requires piecing together multiple independent streams of evidence. Satellite imagery alone can show a fishing harbor's physical layout and any unusual activity patterns over time, but it can't definitively distinguish a civilian fishing boat from a similarly sized fast attack craft without additional confirming evidence. That confirming evidence has come from a combination of CENTCOM's own footage released following specific strikes, independently verified social media videos showing the aftermath of these attacks, and the broader pattern of which specific locations have been struck compared to the thousands of genuinely civilian fishing operations along Iran's coastline that have not been targeted at all throughout this entire war. Let's walk through the specific evidence from the Banood Pier strike in detail, because it's one of the clearest documented examples of this entire pattern. The strike occurred on July 9th in Bushehr province, and satellite imagery captured in its aftermath showed plumes of smoke rising from what the imagery itself confirms was, at least in its physical infrastructure, a fishing harbor. That alone might not be conclusive evidence of a legitimate military strike against a genuinely military target. But independently, images and footage shared on social media corroborated the attack, specifically showing boats actively on fire at the location, footage confirmed by AFP as depicting burning fishing boats at the Banood Pier specifically. Combining the satellite confirmation of the strike's physical location and timing with independently verified footage showing exactly what burned at that location gives you a considerably more complete picture than either piece of evidence would provide on its own. It's worth understanding why this kind of layered, cross-referenced verification process matters so much for a story like this one, because it's precisely the methodology that separates careful open-source analysis from simply repeating whatever claim either side in this conflict happens to be making publicly. Iran's government, as we'll discuss shortly, has strong incentive to frame every one of these coastal strikes as an attack on civilian infrastructure, since that framing serves its broader information warfare objectives, regardless of what was actually destroyed at any specific location. The United States, conversely, has its own incentive to frame every strike as precisely targeted against legitimate military assets. Neither side's unverified claim alone should be treated as conclusive. What actually resolves the question is independent third-party verification. In this specific case, AFP's confirmation of exactly what the burning vessels in the footage actually were, combined with the broader pattern of coordinated timing that makes a purely civilian, militarily insignificant target considerably less plausible as an explanation for why the specific location was struck. Now, here's the detail that actually resolves the core question at the heart of this entire story. Were these strikes hitting genuine civilian fishing infrastructure, or were they hitting military assets deliberately concealed among it? The Banood Pier strike didn't happen in isolation. It coincided directly with a broader wave of attacks across Bushehr that same period, including strikes near the Bushehr nuclear power plant itself, alongside separately reported explosions in the southeastern cities of Kanarak and Chabahar later that same evening. A strike against a genuinely random, militarily insignificant fishing pier wouldn't logically coincide with a coordinated wave of attacks against confirmed military and nuclear infrastructure occurring simultaneously across the same province. The timing and coordination of these strikes, hitting Banood Pier alongside confirmed military significant targets in the same operational window, is itself strong circumstantial evidence that American targeting intelligence had already identified Banood Pier as something more than an ordinary civilian fishing operation before the strike occurred. Let's talk about Kish Island specifically, because it represents a second, separately documented example of this exact same pattern. And it helps confirm this isn't a single isolated incident, but a genuinely systematic campaign. Fires broke out at port facilities on Kish Island during the same broader wave of American attacks. Another location that, like Banood Pier, presents on the surface as civilian port infrastructure rather than an obvious military naval facility. Kish Island itself has long been known primarily as a free trade zone and tourist destination in Iran, making it, if anything, an even less intuitive target for anyone assuming American strikes are focused purely on obviously military locations. The fact that port facilities there were also struck, producing confirmed fires, fits directly into the broader pattern of targeting dispersed, civilian-presenting infrastructure, specifically because that infrastructure has been repurposed to conceal military assets. Here's the number that puts the true scale of this entire campaign into perspective. The United States has carried out more than 300 strikes on Iran since July 8th alone. 300 strikes in this specific window represents an extraordinary operational tempo. And the fact that a meaningful portion of those strikes have targeted small ports and coastal infrastructure, rather than exclusively large, obviously military facilities, tells you this isn't an occasional opportunistic tactic. It's become a core, sustained component of the broader campaign against Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the strait. Let's connect this directly to something we covered in a previous video, because it fits together with the CENTCOM data on exactly how many fast attack boats this specific campaign has actually targeted. CENTCOM confirmed striking more than 80 locations in a single operation, including over 60 IRGC small boats operating in and around the Strait of Hormuz specifically, alongside air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar installations, and anti-ship missile capabilities. That single operation, striking more than 60 small boats in one coordinated wave, gives you a sense of the actual scale of the fleet Iran has been dispersing and concealing across this coastal network. This isn't a handful of boats hidden at one or two locations. It's a substantial fleet, distributed deliberately across dozens of separate points along Iran's coastline, specifically to make exactly this kind of comprehensive single operation strike considerably harder to execute. And that specific operation, striking more than 60 boats simultaneously, came directly in response to attacks on 3 commercial vessels in the strait: the Marshall Islands flagged tanker Al-Rakayat, the Saudi Arabia flagged tanker Wedyan, and the Liberia flagged Cyprus Prosperity. CENTCOM's own language described these attacks on commercial shipping as, in its own words, unwarranted aggression and a direct violation of the ceasefire framework established under the Memorandum of Understanding signed back on June 17th. This connects the coastal hideout strikes directly back into the broader pattern we've covered extensively in previous videos. Iran attacks commercial shipping using exactly the kind of small, fast attack boats capable of hiding among civilian fishing vessels, and the United States responds by systematically dismantling the concealed infrastructure that makes those attacks possible in the first place, rather than simply defending against each individual attack as it happens. Now let's talk about a genuinely fascinating technical dimension of this specific phase of the war, because it connects directly to something we've covered before regarding the Lucas drone program and the broader technology race defining this conflict. Many of these coastal attacks have also created an operational opportunity for the United States to actually deploy and test some of its newer one-way attack drones and small unmanned vessels in live combat conditions against exactly this kind of dispersed small target environment. Think about why coastal strikes against small, individually modest targets represent a particularly useful testing ground for this kind of technology. Striking a single large, well-defined military facility with a conventional precision munition is a different operational problem than efficiently neutralizing dozens of small, individually low-value, but collectively significant targets spread across a long stretch of coastline. Lower cost, expendable drone systems, similar in concept to the Lucas program we covered in a previous video, are considerably better suited economically and operationally to exactly this kind of dispersed target set than deploying expensive, limited supply precision munitions against every single small boat and pier individually. This detail matters beyond simply being an interesting technical footnote because it suggests the coastal hideout campaign is serving a dual purpose for American military planners. It's degrading Iran's dispersed fast attack boat fleet directly, the primary and most obvious objective. But it's also functioning as a live combat proving ground for exactly the kind of lower cost, expendable strike systems the Pentagon has been developing specifically to counter cheap, dispersed, asymmetric threats throughout this entire war. Every strike against a small coastal target using these newer systems generates real combat performance data that informs how these systems get refined and deployed in whatever comes next in this conflict, whether that's continued operations against Iran specifically or eventually entirely different theaters and adversaries facing the same basic dispersed threat problem. There's an economic logic underlying this dual-purpose approach that deserves its own explanation because it connects directly to the cost exchange problem we discussed in previous coverage of Iran's drone swarm strategy. Using an expensive precision-guided munition, typically costing well into 6 figures per shot, against a single small fishing boat that may or may not turn out to be a legitimate military asset represents a genuinely poor cost exchange ratio, especially across a target set numbering in the dozens or hundreds spread across an entire coastline. Lower-cost, expendable systems flip that math considerably, allowing American forces to engage a much larger number of individually low-value but collectively significant targets without the same budgetary strain that relying exclusively on premium precision munitions would eventually create, especially across a campaign already running more than 300 strikes deep. Let's talk about what this specific campaign tells you about Iran's broader naval doctrine, and why this particular vulnerability matters so much to the overall balance of this war. We've discussed extensively in previous videos how Iran's core naval strategy throughout this entire conflict has centered on asymmetric, saturation-style attacks. Small boats, drones, and missiles operating in coordinated swarms specifically designed to overwhelm the defensive capacity of technologically superior American and allied naval forces. That doctrine depends fundamentally on Iran maintaining a sufficiently large, sufficiently dispersed fleet of small, fast, expendable vessels capable of launching these coordinated attacks from multiple points along the coastline simultaneously, systematically hunting down and destroying the concealed basing infrastructure that fleet depends on doesn't just remove individual boats from Iran's order of battle. It attacks the entire structural foundation. The saturation attack doctrine has been built around throughout this war. Think about the compounding effect of this specific campaign over time. Every fishing harbor, pier, or small port that gets struck and confirmed as a concealed fast attack boat basing site doesn't just remove whatever boats happen to be present at that specific location during that specific strike. It also removes that location as a viable concealment option for Iran going forward, forcing the IRGC to either abandon dispersal entirely and concentrate its remaining fleet at fewer, more obviously defended locations, which makes that remaining fleet considerably easier to monitor and eventually strike in a single decisive operation, or to continue attempting dispersal across an ever-shrinking pool of coastal locations that haven't yet been identified and struck, a strategy that becomes progressively less effective as American intelligence continues mapping and confirming which specific sites along Iran's coastline are actually being used this way. This dynamic mirrors something we've discussed in previous videos regarding how concealment strategies across this entire war have a genuine shelf life that keeps shortening as intelligence and detection capabilities mature. The same basic logic that applied to pickaxe mountain satellite exposure applies here, just compressed into a much faster operational timeframe. A single hidden nuclear facility can remain concealed for years before detection technology catches up to it. A dispersed fleet of small boats, actively being used in ongoing combat operations against commercial shipping, generates far more observable activity, movement patterns, and opportunities for detection in a much shorter window, meaning the effective concealment lifespan of any single coastal hideout is considerably shorter than a static, deeply buried facility built specifically to avoid detection over a period of years rather than weeks. Let's talk about the human dimension of this specific campaign, because targeting infrastructure that presents, at least on the surface, as civilian fishing operations raises genuinely important questions about how this kind of strike gets verified and justified, questions worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Iran's own government has consistently framed strikes against these coastal locations as attacks against civilian infrastructure and fishing communities, a framing that serves Iran's broader information warfare interests throughout this conflict by casting American strikes as indiscriminate rather than precisely targeted against concealed military assets. The available evidence, the coordination with confirmed military strikes happening simultaneously, the specific footage of armed fast attack boats rather than ordinary fishing vessels burning at these locations, and the sheer number of confirmed small boat targets CENTCOM has documented striking in single coordinated operations strongly supports the American characterization of these as legitimate military targets rather than indiscriminate strikes against civilian fishing communities. But that evidence doesn't mean every single strike against every single small port along this coastline has necessarily hit exactly what it was intended to hit. And the genuine possibility of civilian fishing infrastructure being damaged or destroyed alongside legitimate military targets, particularly in a campaign striking more than 300 locations in a matter of weeks, is a real cost of this specific strategy that shouldn't be dismissed simply because the broader targeting pattern appears well justified. And there's a broader economic dimension worth including here too, because Iran's fishing industry, separate entirely from the military question, represents genuine livelihood for communities along this exact stretch of coastline. Even strikes that precisely and successfully target only concealed military assets inevitably occur within and around genuine civilian fishing infrastructure that fishing families in these communities depend on for their income. A pier that gets struck because it was concealing fast attack boats is still a pier that legitimate fishing operations were also using, and its destruction, regardless of how militarily justified the strike itself may have been, still represents a real economic disruption to civilian communities that had no direct involvement in Iran's military decision-making, echoing a pattern of civilian economic harm we've discussed in previous videos regarding the broader costs this entire war has imposed on people with no direct stake in the underlying dispute between Washington and Tehran. It's also worth considering how Iran's own government has almost certainly factored this dynamic into its strategic calculations from the very beginning. Deliberately concealing military assets among civilian fishing infrastructure doesn't just provide operational concealment benefits. It also creates exactly the kind of ambiguous, contested narrative environment we've walked through in this video, where every strike against these locations generates a genuine information warfare opportunity for Iran, regardless of the strike's actual military justification. Whether or not that dual benefit, operational concealment paired with propaganda value from the resulting civilian infrastructure framing, was an explicit part of Iran's original planning when it began dispersing its fleet this way, it's certainly become a real and repeatedly exploited consequence of the strategy as this specific campaign has unfolded. Let's zoom out and place this entire coastal hideout campaign into the broader trajectory of the naval war we've covered across several previous videos, because it fits directly into a pattern of increasingly sophisticated, increasingly precise American targeting throughout this conflict. We've covered the naval blockade enforcing economic pressure against Iran's oil exports. We've covered the successful defense of 3 American destroyers against a coordinated saturation attack, followed by a precisely targeted retaliatory strike against the specific launch sites responsible. We've covered the Lucas drone program specifically engineered to counter Iran's own drone doctrine using Iran's own design principles turned back against it. This coastal hideout campaign represents the next logical extension of that same broader strategic approach. Rather than simply reacting to attacks as they happen or maintaining a purely defensive blockade posture, American forces have moved towards systematically dismantling the underlying infrastructure and concealment networks that make Iran's entire asymmetric naval strategy possible in the first place. That shift from reactive defense to proactive dismantlement of underlying military infrastructure represents a genuinely significant evolution in how this specific dimension of the war is being fought. And it connects directly to the broader economic pressure campaign we've covered extensively regarding the naval blockade's cost to Iran's oil revenue. A blockade that's simultaneously being enforced by warships, while the underlying fast attack boat fleet capable of contesting that blockade gets systematically hunted down and destroyed, represents 2 mutually reinforcing pressure campaigns rather than a single isolated tactic. Each strike against a concealed coastal hideout doesn't just remove military assets, it further degrades Iran's already limited capacity to meaningfully contest the blockade that's been costing it hundreds of millions of dollars daily, according to the figures we've covered in previous coverage of this specific naval campaign. There's a broader lesson here about how modern asymmetric naval warfare actually gets countered over the course of a sustained conflict, one that extends beyond just this specific war between the United States and Iran. Cheap, dispersed, asymmetric threats are genuinely difficult to counter through purely reactive, defensive posture alone, since a defender responding only to each individual attack as it happens is perpetually fighting from a position of disadvantage against an attacker who chooses the timing and location of every engagement. The shift toward proactively identifying and dismantling the underlying infrastructure an asymmetric threat depends on rather than simply defending against its individual manifestations, represents a genuinely different and, based on the pattern documented throughout this specific campaign, considerably more effective approach to neutralizing exactly this kind of dispersed, concealment-dependent military doctrine. So where does this actually leave us in terms of understanding the broader trajectory of this specific dimension of the war? The systematic targeting of Iran's coastal hideout network represents a genuine escalation in sophistication and scope compared to earlier phases of this conflict, moving beyond simply defending against and retaliating for individual attacks toward comprehensively dismantling the concealment infrastructure Iran's entire saturation attack naval doctrine depends on. The evidence supporting these strikes as legitimate military targeting, rather than indiscriminate attacks against civilian fishing communities, is considerably stronger than Iran's own public framing suggests. Based on the coordination with confirmed military targets, the specific footage of armed vessels rather than ordinary fishing boats, and the sheer documented scale of small boat targets, CENTCOM has confirmed striking in coordinated operations. But the campaign's sheer scale, more than 300 strikes since early July alone, also means genuine civilian economic disruption to fishing communities along this coastline is a real ongoing cost of this specific strategy, regardless of how well targeted the underlying military objectives may actually be. Before you go, two things I genuinely appreciate. First, if walking through exactly how satellite imagery, independently verified footage, and the broader pattern of coordinated strikes actually confirms what's hiding at these coastal locations, rather than just accepting the headline at face value, gave you a clearer picture than a single strike report could provide. Share this with someone trying to understand this specific, genuinely underappreciated dimension of the war. That's the only way analysis like this reaches people, instead of getting buried under shorter clips that mention a strike happened without ever explaining why the target actually mattered. Second, I want your take in the comments. Do you think this systematic campaign against Iran's dispersed fast attack boat network genuinely breaks the saturation attack doctrine that's defined so much of Iran's naval strategy throughout this war? Or does Iran simply find new, harder to detect concealment methods the way it's adapted throughout the rest of this conflict? Drop your thoughts below. I read every one of them, and if this breakdown delivered real value, hit like so more people trying to understand this specific thread of the war get the chance to see it. Let's close with the full picture. Since July 8th, the United States has carried out more than 300 strikes against Iran, and a significant portion of them have targeted small ports, fishing piers, and coastal infrastructure stretching from Bushehr to Chabahar, sites that present on the surface as civilian fishing operations, but have been systematically confirmed through a combination of satellite imagery, independently verified social media footage, and the coordinated timing of these strikes alongside confirmed military targets to be concealing significant portions of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' fast attack boat fleet. The strike at Banood Pier in Bushehr province, along with the confirmed fires at port facilities on Kish Island, represent two of the clearest documented examples of this pattern, both showing armed vessels rather than ordinary fishing boats burning in the aftermath. CENTCOM has separately confirmed striking more than 80 locations in a single operation, including over 60 IRGC small boats specifically, directly in response to attacks on 3 commercial vessels transiting the strait, tying this coastal hideout campaign directly back into the broader naval blockade and shipping security effort we've covered extensively in previous videos. This campaign has also created opportunity to test newer, lower-cost drone and unmanned vessel systems against exactly the kind of dispersed, small target environment these coastal locations represent, generating real combat data that will likely inform how those systems get refined going forward. Whether this systematic dismantlement of Iran's coastal concealment network represents a lasting structural blow to Iran's entire saturation attack naval doctrine, or simply forces Iran toward new concealment methods, American intelligence hasn't yet identified, remains the open question defining the next phase of this specific dimension of the war. Stay locked in, because the moment the next hidden site gets exposed, I'll be breaking down exactly what was found there with this same level of depth.